Assassin's Creed, a long series of different games that has gained a huge following and has become one of the most popular games of our generation.
But where did it begin? How did this historical game with so much depth become this huge AAA game?
It is actually pretty simple and was born out of another well known game that most parents might remember playing. Hi, I'm Dylan.
And I'm Eden.
We are Jacksonville State University students, and we are in a video game history class focusing on Assassin's Creed.
We're going to be talking about the history and its evolution from Prince of Persia into Assassin's Creed, the graphics, the gameplay, and the art.
Assassin's Creed has many games, including spin offs and mobile games, and we are not trying to diminish the history of these games. However, for our purposes, we will only be focusing on the main games for the most part, and because of that, here are all of the games and the years that they were released that we are mostly covering. Assassin's Creed 2007, Assassin's Creed 2, 2009, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood 2010, Assassin's Creed Revelations 2011, Assassin's Creed 3 2012, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag 2013, Assassin's Creed Rogue 2014, Assassin's Creed Unity 2014, Assassin's Creed Syndicate 2015, Assassin's Creed Origins 2017, Assassin's Creed Odyssey 2018, and Assassin's Creed Valhalla.
To talk about the history of Assassin's Creed, you have to delve back, way far back, to actually close to the beginnings of the golden age of video games, some might say, and to a game called Prince of Persia. This game was released on October 3rd, 1989, and published by Brotherhood. This game was actually created by one man named Jordan Mesher, and you'll hear a lot about him later on because he, if you think about it, he kind of created the ideas for Assassin's Creed. So Jordan Mesher was a Yale University graduate, and before he created Prince of Persia, he created a game called Karateka, and this laid the groundwork for Prince of Persia. And he actually didn't really want to make Prince of Persia. He said video games weren't his only passion. He was actually wanted to be a screenwriter, and wanted to work with movies. He actually stated, what I really wanted to do was make movies and to be a screenwriter. I was afraid I couldn't do both, that if I started on another game, it would become my life, and I'd end up never pursuing my other dream. But he eventually did pursue the life of video games. So, Prince of Persia eventually came out on the Apple II and the MS-DOS, but it was a complete failure on both of these. But it was later ported onto a lot of different consoles. Pretty much all the consoles of the day it was ported to. Some of the noted ones is the NES, the SNES, the Game Boy, the Sega CD. It was even on the iOS, and that's where it became a hit, and people loved it, and it became a classic. The inspiration behind this game was actually by movies. Jordan Mesher, since he was more passionate about movies, he really drew a lot of inspiration from Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. He wanted to make a similarly pioneering game that was completely different than the other games. He really wanted it to be more realistic in storytelling, much less like other games at the time, like Mario. He stated here also that in most platform puzzle games at the time, characters were weightless. It was an abstract representation of jumping and falling. It never felt real. And he also wanted to portray a story, so he also stated it's a story you play, not a story that's told to you, and that was something new in video games. He was really ahead of his time when actually making this game. He created it with rotoscoping so that the animations would be more realistic, and Eden will touch more on the rotoscoping later. And it was also very progressive because most players could beat this game. As we've been learning in class, most games back in the day were very challenging, and they were made that way to eat up coins. But since this was a home game, then you could play it whenever you wanted. So most players could beat this game, unlike other games where you had to be a hardcore gamer to beat this game. Later on, he did move on to another game, the sequel of Prince of Persia, called Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and Flame. He didn't really develop this one as much. He created the story and laid the groundwork for it, and he didn't touch a line of code for that one, he says. But it wasn't very groundbreaking, and it was released in 1992, but it wasn't very groundbreaking. Nobody really remembers this one. It was pretty much the same as the first one. But then he didn't really take part in any other Prince of Persia games for quite a few years. There were others made, but he was not a part of them, so we won't touch on those. We're only going to touch on the ones with Mesher in them. So then we move on to the most important one, which was Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, which was also a very groundbreaking game, and this is when Ubisoft takes over. But he was deeply involved into this one. He was actually the writer, the designer, and one of the producers for this game. And it was created more as a labor of love. It was a recreation of the original Prince of Persia, but it was made in 3D graphics. It's more of what Mesher envisioned in his first game. And they wanted to create something very ambitious in the industry, but they were trying to break new ground with it. And this game was actually directed by a guy named Patrice Desilets. And it was developed by Ubisoft Montreal and published by Ubisoft, and eventually was released in November 2003. It was released on the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, Xbox, and Windows PC. This game was very story-driven. It had 3D graphics, and it really focused also on the gameplay-wise. The parkour, it was a hack and slash with puzzles, and it had this cool time rewind mechanic where you could, if you messed up, you could rewind time and redo the things again. So it was kind of like having your own little artifact that caused you to be able to do things that weren't really realistic. They also had the parkour on there was sort of realistic, but there was a wall running mechanic that was a little far-fetched. But it was actually very well received. It was actually now considered a PlayStation 2 classic, and there's actually a remake coming in January 21st, 2021. That shows how popular it was. So, later on, Patrice Desilets was told to work on the sequel for this game. So, he was given about a month break, and then he got to go straight back into work into the sequel. But he had a little bit of different ideas about it. He didn't really like the idea of the prince being the protagonist, because a prince is just a guy that is waiting to be king. So Desilets remembered that he read a book about secret societies, and one of his favorite parts was about a man named Hassan is-Sabah. He was a Muslim missionary back in around the 11th century. He had founded an order called the Assassinian, later known as the Assassins. They had a fearsome reputation where they delivered a very swift death to political and religious leaders. And they even took a quote from him that is used very often in Assassin's Creed called "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." He also drew a lot of inspiration from a book called Alamut by Vladimir Bartol. And so they started to go into this direction of assassins. And they came up with a name called Prince of Persia Assassin. So they, instead of making the protagonist a prince, they made the protagonist into an assassin who is trying to save a child prince. And they wanted the assassin to have a reason to want to be better. He was the second highest assassin. He wanted to be the leader. But then everybody really liked the ideas of the assassins. So slowly and surely, the idea of the prince was slowly squeezed out, and the assassins became the primary focus of the game. Then they added the Knights Templar as the kind of conflict against the assassins, fighting over these different artifacts that could control the world. They were going after the same idea, but fighting against each other. They also created the protagonist by the name of Altair, which translates in Arabic to bird of prey, which creates a lot of eagle visions. And they wanted the game to be really realistic, but in games, it's hard to have a completely realistic game, but it also be fun. Games are used as a way to escape our reality. So they found a way to make the parkour look believable, but also fun. They later decided to pitch the idea of the Animus, which was a way to delve back into time through your DNA, so to look at your ancestors. They did this so that they could not just focus on one protagonist, but be able to actually go in different times and look at it, different assassins during different points in time. They actually wanted to, at one point, go over the death of JFK, and you play as the assassin that kills JFK. The Animus also was able to clear up a lot of plot holes, such as dying, respawning, and fast travel, and it created a whole entire different story outside of the story inside the story. It's really cool how they were able to do that. So one thing that's very interesting about that is they were able to create a second protagonist by the name of Desmond Miles in the present day looking into the past. So essentially there's two protagonists that you play as. So after they had all of this, they compiled their ideas together and started building the game. They really wanted to focus on the art environment and the liberty to make your own choices and exploration in the game. They really wanted this game to be alive, but they couldn't really do that on the old hardware. They decided to move on to the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 generation of consoles because it gave them a lot of liberties that they wanted to do for Sands of Time, but they couldn't because of the limitations at the time. And because of this, they were able to push further and create what they wanted for Sands of Time, but in a completely different game. Decele, it actually states, in Sands of Time, I wanted the palace to be full of people, but I couldn't draw more than 8 characters because we had 32 megabytes of RAM on the PlayStation 2. I needed a portion of that RAM for rewind, so 6 or 7 characters was the maximum on screen. But now you were able to have streets full of people carrying different things and having their own ideas. People had their own spotting system where enemies would spot you and start chasing you, and so much more because of this hardware change to the new generation. So it opened up the gateway for them to have an open world that was historically accurate and beautiful, and that was because of those new consoles. And so the Scimitar engine, more on this later with Eden, was created specifically for Assassin's Creed to be able to handle this game. They also made it where the environment was completely climbable, yet historically accurate for this time period, so that there was a whole new way of getting around maps. And instead of just driving a car or just running up and down the streets, it was completely new for its time. And they even created this idea of viewpoints as an incentive for the players to explore and see all these sites, and then have what was called the leap of faith, and just tied more into the lore, and everything just connected together. But it really does kind of connect to theater in a way, how there are reasons that these things were put in. And actually, all this stuff that happened was only developed in 3 years. So we can see how far technology has come in that aspect. And then moving on, they moved on to Assassin's Creed 2, which was released in November 2009. DeCelle was also the director of that, and they really capitalized on the failings of the first Assassin's Creed and built on to the better parts of it. They created the protagonist Ezio Auditore da Firenze as the new protagonist, and set it in Renaissance Italy, completely far off from where we were at during the Crusades, in the medieval times. And it was able to build a better flowing story instead of having the reoccurring missions that Assassin's Creed 1 kept doing. And it really opened up the gateway for them to have a whole entire series of different games. They improved the gameplay with having like a dual assassin blade system. The combat system was improved, the parkour system was improved, and there was more tools to assassinate. And another cool thing they added was they added more historical characters that you can see while playing and interact with them, and it add more depth to this whole story, such as Leonardo da Vinci. He was a part of Assassin's Creed 2, and he created tools for Ezio to use for his assassinations, and you were able to upgrade your gear and buy new gear and upgrade your own homestead and stuff. And then they moved on to Brotherhood, and they capitalized again a little bit more and added more onto that. But Brotherhood was actually DeCelle's last Assassin's Creed game. It continues Ezio's story, where he builds an assassin's guild and is able to build up the Order of Assassins bigger, and it was focused more on Rome. And continuing on, the games do get very repetitive in the sense of their gameplay, but they had their system that did work. They added more things, such as different ways to assassinate and just more bug fixes and capitalizing on bigger things of the past games that they used. They actually did something really cool where they were able to start putting in small like mini games into one game, and if people liked that part, then they would make it bigger into the next game. Then they came out with Revelations after Brotherhood, released in 2011, and after this they started going on to a yearly cycle of creating a new Assassin's Creed game each year. And Revelations continued the story of Ezio delving into the more Assassin's path, and it actually it does a full circle and shows the rest of Altair's life, and was able to close out that story. And then they move on to Assassin's Creed 3, which was released in 2012. There is actually, if you play the games, I'm not trying to do too much spoilers, but the year 2012 does play a big role into that. And in this one, you actually change protagonists. This is the first time you change protagonists in 3 whole games. And you play as Connor Kenway, a Native American and a bastard son of a Templar. So that creates more friction, and it's set during the Revolutionary War. And they And this is actually where they end the storyline of Desmond Miles outside of the Animus. And after that, it starts getting kind of hazy and weird. But development-wise, it's still very similar. They just keep adding on more and more. Then they moved on to Black Flag, which was released in 2013, and you had a change. It was actually a prequel to Assassin's Creed 3, and you had another change of protagonist, Edward Kenway, and you were a pirate in the Caribbean. This one was actually something to note because it was released on the previous generation and the new generation. This was another time for the turn of the generation for consoles, and this whole series is able to go from one generation to the next. And it pushed for better graphics from the move from the Xbox 360 and PS3 over to the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. They were able to create two different games. They put it on both generations, but they had more on the newer generations, such as better graphics, better gameplay. People didn't really know how to feel about that. They were glad that we were able to play it on both consoles without having to go on an upgrade right away if you wanted to play Assassin's Creed, but it was still it was way better if you got the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, because they put way more work into that, and they took out a lot of stuff in the PlayStation 3 as an incentive to move on to the better graphics and the better consoles. Then we move on to another game called Rogue, which was really interesting to note too, because this game was actually only released on the previous generation of consoles, the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. And people were really confused about this, but they created this as kind of an apology for putting the Black Flag, better graphics and whatnot into the new generation. And it was a completely different story, and where you actually play as an assassin that turns into a Templar, and you go around killing assassins. And but people actually considered this a cult classic. And I've heard many people actually really like this game, but also not a lot of people remember it either. And then we move on to Unity. Unity was held as the worst Assassin's Creed. It was released in 2014 on the next generation of consoles, and you could tell that they really put a lot of time into the graphics of this game. You played as Arnaud Dorian during the French Revolution and the first French Revolution. This was the first game to have co-op. The other games had multiplayer, but were mainly focusing on the single-player aspects of this. But this one did have co-op in the main story of it, and it was the first and the only one to have that. The reason that Unity was held as the worst Assassin's Creed because it was plagued with glitches. It seemed like Ubisoft decided to put more time into the graphics and things that people really didn't care about, and decided not to clean it up. Everybody said it felt rushed and just not good. The only cool parts about it was the co-op, and you were able to customize your costumes in that. That was the first one where you were able to go in depth with your costumes. Then Syndicate came out right after that one, which was released in 2015. It was set in Victorian London, and you actually played as two protagonists in this, and if you count the person outside the Animus, you played as three protagonists. And this was really good for the time because it was the first time that you get to play as a female protagonist. The twins' names were Evie and Jacob Fry, and one of them is a female, and that was great for the time because this was a first main stage game, Assassin's Creed game, where you were able to do that. And the interesting thing to note also is that they took out multiplayer in this one. And for me, I would consider Syndicate as the most forgotten game. Nobody really talks about this one. It's always forgotten. And moving on, this is a big point to make to the present Assassin's Creed. So Ubisoft decided to take a 2-year gap instead of their usual yearly basis of Assassin's Creed. They wanted to take their time with this one and create an actual good game to make up for their past mistakes with Unity and Syndicate. So they released this one in 2017, and this was Assassin's Creed Origins. And it was a complete change of form for Assassin's Creed. There were many, many changes in this one. In this one, you play as Bayek of Siwa in the Egypt Ptolemaic period of 49 to 44 BCE. And it was an RPG rather than the regular Assassin's Creed games. They had upgradable armor, resource collecting, and the biggest point was the leveling system, where you could not kill certain characters in certain areas until you reached a certain level. And this was a big point because you could no longer instantly assassinate people by sneaking up on them if you were too low of a level. For me personally, that was a little bit infuriating for myself. But this was a time for Ubisoft to really delve back into the lore of the Assassins and tell the origin of the Assassins and the Templar, and just go back and kind of retcon a lot of ideas that people had about the Assassins and change it up for the future so that they can continue making Assassin's Creed games and fix the story. This game actually received a lot of high praise for its complete change of form and trying to breathe new life into this series that had been running for a long time. And a lot of people said that it started becoming it was the same every time, and they wanted something new. So this was Ubisoft's answer to that. And then after that, they had created Odyssey, which was still on the same terms of Origins, just there was changes here and there with the RPG style, just still in the same style, but changes to it. And this one, you get to play as 2 characters. You either play as Cassandra or Alexios. And there was a big controversy about this because Cassandra was originally pitted to be the main protagonist, the only protagonist. You wouldn't get the choice, but there was a big controversy because Ubisoft was being very sexist at the time, and they said that women don't sell. So they wanted people to have the choice of playing as a male or a female, which this was hard because they had completely different voice actors and it just didn't fit the story right. So Cassandra fits the protagonist way better than Alexios, but that's more of my opinion, and also it is kind of backed up by facts too. But this game takes place in Greece during the Peloponnesian War of 431 to 422 BCE. So it is a prequel to Origins, which is kind of ironic. And you play as a Spartan who is taking down the cult of Cosmos, which is kind of an earlier version of the Templars. And this one actually started focusing more on the first civilization and the Isu, which the first civilization in the Isu is something that has been touched on in Assassin's Creed, kind of in the background. You have to delve more into the lore of it to get that, but Ubisoft decided to bring this more into the limelight, where the issue was a different breed of kind of like humans that were more advanced, and there was a civilization before our civilization that was more technologically advanced, but then the world ended and they had to restart anew. So then they also use this as a way to explain mythological elements that happened in the game. So it didn't really have as much realism in the game. It started delving more into the sci-fi aspects of Assassin's Creed, which is a big kind of turnaround for it. But the game did have great reception. A lot of people loved this game, myself included. I did enjoy the game. Didn't feel like Assassin's Creed, but we're talking more about the facts. And interesting note about Odyssey, there was actually a side quest in it that is titled Prince of Persia, where you go around to different viewpoints looking at different things, and this guy who ends up being the Prince of Persia is telling you stories. So it is a big hint back to Sands of Time itself. And this finally brings us to our final game, which is the one that just came out recently, which was Valhalla. And this is also the third time where they come between generations, which is between the PS4 and the Xbox One and the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. But this one was kind of different because there wasn't that big of a jump between the two generations. They didn't really capitalize onto the newer graphics and newer processing powers of the new systems. There wasn't even ray tracing in this game, which a lot of people have been really wanting, and that's something that's been coming with the new series of consoles. This game was released this year in 2020. It takes place in the Viking era, and you play as Eivor, a Viking who you can choose to be male or female, which is different from Odyssey, where you, instead of playing as two completely different characters, you play as the same character, but you choose if they're male or female. And this one, they focus more onto the fantasy side of the game. And again, they're slowly pulling away from the realism and historical accuracy of the game to make it more fantastical. And it feels like they're pulling away from the Assassin's Creed and focusing just more on history under the name of Assassin's Creed. But that is all of the main Assassin's Creed games, but there were spin-offs. There were actually quite a few spin-offs that came in between many different of the Assassin's Creed games. So technically there was an Assassin's Creed game released every single year since 2007. And all of them played very similarly. They were all side-scrollers, very similar to Prince of Persia, but it still had the gameplay elements of Assassin's Creed, where you have the stealth elements, and you are going and assassinating different targets and getting collectibles. These were used as ways to also deepen the lore and tell more about the favorite characters. The ones that were released on the iOS focused on Ezio and Altair. And then they also came out with 3 games under a trilogy called Chronicles, where you play as assassins from, one of the games was China, another one was Russia, and another one was India. And it kind of pays homage to Prince of Persia in a way, because it does have that side-scrolling element, and it creates a whole circle back around to its origins.
I am going to talk about the evolution of how the games came to be designed. First, a brief history of how Prince of Persia came to Ubisoft and how it inspired Assassin's Creed. Doug and Gary Carlson founded Brotherhood together after Doug wrote his first computer game. He was a screenplay writer, but he was branching out. They brought in Jordan Mencher after seeing his work on Karateka, which really impressed them. They started talking about a game to develop. They decided on a setting based on the Middle Eastern world of 1001 Nights, and they added Broderbund's own Lode Runner and the Castles of Dr. Creep to that framework. They decided on what would eventually become the Prince of Persia series. They needed other graphics for the acrobatics because they wanted to make the game sell really well and wanted something for them to stand apart. So Jordan Mencher got his brother, mostly because he would work for free, David Mencher, to put on some baggy white pants and let Jordan film him running around, and then he traced that onto his computer. After years of Carlson trying to buy out the learning company pulled an Uno reverse card and bought out Broderbund, laying off half of the employees. The Prince of Persia games were developed using the Jade engine, by the way. When Prince of Persia 3D was under production, it crumpled under the strict deadlines by the learning company and ultimately flopped for having too many bugs and bad design. After the failure, Mencher went to Ubisoft Montreal to see their AVIs and was impressed. He licensed out Prince of Persia for Sands of Time and agreed to be a consultant, writing the story and screenplay. But in 2003, he moved up to Montreal and became a designer. The game engine for the first Assassin's Creed game is called Scimitar. It was only used in 3 games: Assassin's Creed in 2007, followed by the 2008 Prince of Persia game, and Shaun White's snowboarding. Claude Langlaise, the technical director of Ubisoft, had a huge hand in developing it. He alluded in an interview to it being developed specifically for games like Assassin's Creed. The environmental modeling is done in 3ds Max, and the character modeling is done in ZBrush. Human IK's middleware is used to correctly position the hands and feet during climbing and pushing. Assassin's Creed was nominated for Best Technology for a Video Game Engine in 2008 at the Game Developers' Choice Awards, as well as Best Visual Arts. This would pretty much start the Assassin's Creed series to being, an artistic series known for its graphics. After Assassin's Creed 1, the name of the engine was changed to Anvil, and then was changed to Anvil 2 after Assassin's Creed 1, the name of the engine was changed to Anvil, and was improved in Assassin's Creed 2. The features added included a full night and day cycle, enhanced draw distance, the same vegetation technology used in Far Cry 2, improved lighting, reflection, and special effects, new cloth system, and a new AI and NPC navigation system. In 2012, the system was updated into Anvil Next for Assassin's Creed 3 and enabled up to 3,000 NPCs to be rendered in real time. This provided a lot of places to hide. It also used Far Cry 4's ability to change the game based on player actions and new water technology, which became very, very prominent in Assassin's Creed 4. The engine is currently known as Anvil Next 2.0, changed in 2014 during the development of Assassin's Creed Unity. In Assassin's Creed Unity and beyond, it was capable of generating structures much more efficiently, drastically reducing the time artists spent rendering the urban environments. Physically based rendering, or PBR, is a standout feature of Anvil Next, which allows objects to more realistically react with light and shading.
Moving on to the gameplay of Assassin's Creed, we'll first focus on the story. The story takes place in a world where a company called Abstergo creates a device called the Animus, where you can live your ancestors' lives through their eyes. You play as a man called Desmond Miles, who has a lot of assassin ancestry. Come to find out, there is an unseen war going on between the two orders, the Templars and the Assassins. The Templars want control, and the Assassins want freedom. There are also artifacts called the Artifacts of Eden that do different fantastical things that have the power to control or to destroy the world. Your mission is to secure these artifacts and keep them from Templar control so they cannot take over the world. This is the main story, and it eventually expands from there into a whole entire world of different lore that could take days to completely cover. And onto the gameplay, you have to assassinate different high-value targets in order to thin out the Templars and keep them under control. You are able to do this with different assassination techniques, such as the hidden blade that you have to use stealth to instantly kill your target. Reaching your target, you have to use your environment, so parkour comes into play where you can climb any building you want to take different paths to get to your target or escape your pursuers. If you are caught in a corner, you can use your sword play to attack, parry, or counter your attackers. It is very time-based and it can take a lot of skill. The later games add on to these main gameplay elements where you gain new weapons and tools to help assassinate your targets easier or defend yourself better. Ubisoft has done a great job of adding more and more to each game so that you actually feel like you're in the times using the weapons that they would have used and during this time and the techniques they would have used during this time too.
David Chateauneuf, the lead designer of AC1, said, "I had to make sure almost everything was climbable. All the houses had to be built in a specific way, and all the props had to be created with restraint and put into the environment correctly. When I saw the huge cathedral in Acre, I'd realized I'd done my job well. That cathedral was built by an artist, and it's 100% climbable. Art and design went hand in hand for the first time in my career." He wanted liberty in the game, and the feeling that the player could do anything he wanted, and he tried to put everything in the right place so that every player could choose their own strategies for their targets. The jump between the console generations of PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 gave Chateauneuf the RAM he needed to render hundreds of people to inhabit his impressive architecture. This worked really well for the hiding mechanics, a lot easier than it did in the first game. The world is very obviously designed in a way that lets you decide what routes you think are best for taking out your targets and the amount of climbing you want to do. Though this does get a little more led or has more rules in the later games. The first game was way more of a sandbox, at least in my opinion, than the later games. And, I mean, that is also backed up by many things I read. I don't know why I said in my opinion. Although the world of Assassin's Creed is vast with much to explore, Altair could not swim. This is because the Scimitar engine could not support it. All of the major Assassin's Creed games from the first game to Unity use the Havoc physics engine, which allows the collision of rigid bodies in 3D. Havoc also evolved later to render garments and cloth, soft bodies, navigation, and the destruction and mutilation of the bodies. I've looked everywhere I can, and I cannot find the physics engine for the rest of the games, but the Havoc was last updated, I think the article said, like, June 17th of 2020, so they might still be using the Havoc engine. I know they're still using Anvil Next 2.0. In an interview, Raphael Lacoste said he tries to put emotion into his concept art that carries into the games. He wants to create a grand world that the players will want to explore. There is a lot of they have so many concept artists for these games. I wanted to talk about them, but there were like 20 or more on every game. And every concept artist has a very specific job, like level design and just characters and just like cover art and stuff, it was really interesting to learn just how big at least the AAA companies can go for all of their concept artists. Speaking of concept artists, Kai Wynn was the original concept artist for Assassin's Creed who came up with the birds of prey imagery. And Altair translates from Arabic as bird of prey. When Felipe Morin first suggested the Apple of Eden, he was laughed at by the team. Then they looked at Renaissance paintings and saw them holding spherical objects, and it worked. So they kept it. They thought it would be really funny if everyone was just fighting over an apple. Next, I want to talk about historical accuracy. It's just one of those things, especially in games like this, that you can't ignore it, especially when this game series specifically was almost founded on it. But I am going to be talking mostly only on visuals and none of the plot or the voice acting or anything like that. I'm also going to be doing a brief overview of historical accuracy. I'm not trying to get too much into it. And disclaimer that I understand that games can only have, there's a sliding scale of like playability and accuracy, and you need to find however far you want to be on that sliding scale. And since certain games are on different teams, or certain games were made by different teams, it seems they have differing opinions of how accurate they want their games to be. Which is fine if that is what the developers wanted. But overall, I think the first game set a precedent, so some people are kind of peeved by the historical accuracy fluctuation. For example, in Assassin's Creed 2, they make the city of Florence as accurate as possible. They move buildings around only for player convenience, making them further away or closer together. And if they want to include buildings that haven't been built yet, they show them as under construction. Valhalla, however, has castles that won't be built for another few hundred years. 1 and 2 seem to have great care put into making the games as accurate as the gameplay will allow, and making sure to represent time, geographical space, architecture, and ethnic groups properly. With geographical space, they generally, in all of the games, only shift this around to be more player-friendly, so it gives you the feel, but not the exact measurements. Or like the moving around of buildings in AC2, or the moving of cities around in Origins, to be easier to get to. As far as ethnic groups go, Assassin's Creed 3, according to one article I read, has a sort of caricature of Native American cultures, whereas Assassin's Creed Origins takes great care in portraying the Greek and the Roman and the Egyptian peoples, and them mixing together and their languages. And they also try to take care in Assassin's Creed 1 to represent that culture as accurately as possible, and from what I have found, it's done really well. There is also a problem in Valhalla with a lot of the cultures being very stylized and sensationalized, which they said in an interview that they wanted a Viking fantasy, which they kind of got. They got the history like decently correct from what I've heard, but they didn't do it all the way. They just kind of gave you a general feel of the Viking times, which has upset a few people, myself kind of included. I liked the digital museum that gives you like the most accuracy possible, but that could also be me being a history nerd. Going back to concept art for just a second, I wanted to say that one of the things that I think is really cool about the Assassin's Creed art is the covering of the eyes by the hood. I mean, they did that on purpose, but the eyes and eyebrows are like the most recognizable features on a human face. So I like the hiding the identity with the hood and the peak on the hood that gives the bird of prey imagery. And I was reading in another article how they originally had these super long flowing robes for Altair, but the game engine just couldn't handle it, so they ended up having to make it shorter. And then they ended up designing Altair to look more so like the back of his robes to look like feathers. And going back to the hidden blades, blade gauntlet designs, like in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, it's like almost like brass knuckles, and it looks really cool and almost steampunk. However, the Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag hidden blade, it gives child vibes to me by just slapping skulls on it. That might just be my personal opinion. It definitely is. But yes, you can definitely tell that different people have handled the different concept art, and they have a huge team to make everything that they need to do possible. So, yeah, that's all for game design.
In closing, we wanted to talk about our personal experiences with the Assassin's Creed series. I know that I've been playing this game for a few years. Not since it came out, actually. My first Assassin's Creed game was 2 a few years, because I'm always late to the video game parties. I never play new games. But that really made me fall in love with a lot of Italian history. I know it got me really, really invested, and then I didn't finish it before I went back to play 1.
And for me, I've definitely, I've been really deep into Assassin's Creed pretty much since it came out. I remember playing the first one at friends' houses, but the first one I owned was 2, and I got to play through all of it, and it caused me also to love Italian history. So I've played almost every main AAA title of Assassin's Creed. I didn't really like I kind of like the later ones, like the Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla, but for me, I have to say, like, my favorite has to be Brotherhood, because it was just so artistically great, and I love the costumes, and Ezio Auditore was my favorite character out of all of them, but that one's my favorite, and I just have and in total, Assassin's Creed has caused me to have my own love for history.
I would say my favorite is not entirely based on how good the games are. My favorite is Assassin's Creed 4, because I am just a huge fan of pirates and stuff, and I thought the game was really beautiful. I fell in love with it as soon as I started playing. The game that I am most excited to play more of, though, has got to be Odyssey. That's the Greek one, right?
Yep.
I get the names mixed up. But yeah, I love Greek culture, and like everything about it, it's so like enthralling to me. So I'm really, really excited to actually like just get to sit down and play through and just be immersed in all the history that comes in that game.
Yeah, I mean, I've been playing a lot of Valhalla, but I haven't gotten a chance to be really in depth with it. But it's so far, I love Vikings, and so far it's been really fun to play. But I can't give my honest opinion yet because I haven't played all the way through it, but it's so far the graphics are good. I would have to say Odyssey has better graphics than Valhalla, but it's still a really good game, and I did put over 50 hours into Odyssey itself, actually more like 60 hours, and so I have played the crap out of that game, and I do love that one. And Cassandra, she is my woman.
She's hot. I mean,
they sure know how to make protagonists.
They really do be making protagonists hot. I know one of the things that attracted me to AC4 was actually Edward Kenway. I saw him and I was like, hot pirate man, that's it. And I started playing it.
Oh yeah, and they do have a hot pirate woman in there too.
Oh,
so.
They have many a hot pirate woman. I am more so in love with them, I think, than I was originally with Edward Kenway. Can we talk about that Assassin's Creed movie? Have you seen it?
Oh, I have not. The thing is, I own it on DVD, but I have seen the costumes and stuff, and I've seen the trailers, and I've wanted to watch it so many times, and I just haven't sat myself down and watched it because I love playing the games better, and typically with video game movies, they are usually atrocious. Just look at the Super Mario Brothers movie and you'll understand why I hate video game movies.
I have seen the Super Mario Brothers movie, and that is a fever dream. Do not waste your time unless you really just want to sit down and enjoy a bad movie. It wasn't good. I know one dude in the theater just like walked out, and as he was walking past us, he was just like, nah. It was just so funny. I think culturally, I think these games have had a really huge impact. I know that when I first saw them, I was in love with the costumes, of course, because that's who I am as a person. And I played AC1, and I immediately started planning an Altair cosplay, but feminized, because I didn't really have a boyish shape, and I just didn't think it would work that well.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah, when I was a kid, when I got into Assassin's Creed, really, when I was in middle school, I used to try to make Assassin's Creed stuff all the time. I remember I did try to make a costume at one point, but I didn't know how to make costumes, but I was more mechanically engineered, so I decided to make my own hidden blades. And my first rendition of it is I had I had taken plastic bags, wrapped them around my hands, and put butter knives in my wrists. And so when I would swing my hands down, the blades would come out. And then my second design of it, I had made it out of Legos and a letter opener. And that one actually worked really. No, that was my third rendition of it. The second one, I made it out of. I took cardboard and wrapped it in like aluminum foil so it looked like a knife, and I took like a curtain rod that kind of slides in and out, and it actually worked pretty well. So I would just like sling my hand down, it would come out, and then I would just have to push it back in. But the best working one was my final version, and I made it out of Legos and and a letter opener, and that one was really cool. I was really proud of myself for that one.
Yeah, unfortunately in my Altair cosplay, I got through drafting the first layer. And I mean, like, I went through the game, I collected screenshots, like, I was into this. I researched so heavily. And I made, like, the pattern and a bunch of throwing knives. And then I just didn't pick it up anymore after that. And I'm actually kind of disappointed. I should really revisit that.
One of these days I will go back and make, like... I would love the Ezio Auditore from Brotherhood. His costume is my favorite out of all the series. My number one favorite. It was so cool. And I want to make a cosplay of that one and be able to dress up as it, but it's a little bit expensive if you want it to look realistic. Because he has like a lot of leather and that one, and it's very Renaissance-y costumes, so it's super complicated, and I don't have the skills too much to make that, and one of these days I will. One day.
Well, your boy takes commissions. I would like to say, one of the things that I've seen that I don't like about Valhalla is that it strays from history so much, and I understand that there is a level of straying that games need to do in order to make games fun and interesting. And, like, who wants to play a game that's not fun and interesting? Nobody. But, like, the Ubisoft people did say that they really wanted a Viking fantasy, and they did. They made it a Viking fantasy, and I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Yeah, I definitely, with Odyssey and Origins, it seems like as they further go along, they are straying away from the realism a lot. Like, in Odyssey, there was a lot of stuff where they were trying to delve into mythology a little bit too much. I'm like, it's cool. I love mythology.
Yeah.
But you can't... I really want an old Assassin's Creed game. Like, the original Assassin's Creed, where it was completely realistic in a lot of ways, with only spurts of fantasy in it, like the different artifacts of Eden. You would run into them only here and there, and you would run into it like at the end. Oh, yeah. The artifacts of Eden.
I have many artifacts, thank you.
Yeah, that, but it just seems like they're straying a little bit too far away from the realism, which is kind of sad, because after talking about the history of it all, their number one thing they really were trying to focus on was realism, and the environment. I mean, yes, they get the environment right in the aspects of realism, but there's a lot of parts, like there is this skill in Odyssey where you don't take fall damage, and I love that skill when I was playing it, because there were so many times where I would just jump off the side of a cliff and fall like a mile down and just brush it off, and it made it where I could traverse so easy, but it just wasn't realistic.
Yeah, really I do have to say one of the main reasons that I have died in The Witcher 3 has been fall damage more so than any monsters. So, like, I can see where that would be useful, but also, like, should I be able to fall 50 stories and live? No, probably not. That's not how the human body works.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they've always had the leap of faith, but that was more like stretch reality a little bit. Like, yeah, you land in a bale of hay, and that can be believable in a gaming sense, but just falling straight onto the ground on your feet and doing a dive roll, not taking any damage at all, that's not realistic.
Can we talk about how long it took them to put, like, playable women in the game?
Yeah, and yeah, that was a big thing about Assassin's Creed. Like with Cassandra, like there was this thing I was reading about where Cassandra was originally supposed to be the only character you play as the protagonist, but the guys over at Ubisoft were like, women don't sell, so they added Alexios so that people had the choice of being a male or female, and they keep trying to delve into playing as a female character in Assassin's Creed. Like they tried it with Syndicate, but also in Origins, but they kept like dwindling down as much as you can play as the women, because there was a big controversy about Ubisoft being sexist, and it's really sad to see that. And I'm hoping that they'll do better in the future. Valhalla, they still have it where you can play as a male or a female, but this time they make it where it's like the same character rather than choosing one character or another. Mm-hmm. Which I kind of like that. I personally, I like the male version of Eivor. Personally, to me, that's how I'm playing. But when I played Odyssey, I played as Cassandra. I loved Cassandra. She was an amazing protagonist, one of my favorites. But Valhalla was, I feel like Eivor just fits it better, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's entirely fair. All I'm saying is, if I can throw myself from a building and not die, I should be able to have a pair of boobs, you know? Like, that should be an option. It's, yeah, I know that was one thing that always infuriated me. Not to say I didn't like the personalities of the protagonists in Assassin's Creed. It was just that, like, you know, it took them quite a few years to get up to having at least any variety. And I would hate to see what would happen if someone suggested, like, hey, maybe we should put in, like, an intersex or non-binary person, you know? Because then I think all of the Ubisoft headquarters would explode.
Yeah, but I do have to say, like, even though it's usually been male protagonists, they have done a great job in every single Assassin's Creed. They have had very memorable protagonists. Like, I can memorize every single one of them, like Altair, Ezio, there was Edward Kenway, and so on and so forth.
Hey, you missed a few.
Yeah, I missed a few, but, like, I'm not trying to take my time right now trying to name all of them, but I probably could, but because they're just so memorable people. Actually, you know, Liberation, the one for the PS Vita, it did have a female protagonist, and she was, was she Native American or
I think she was an escaped slave.
Yeah, that's right.
Or a freed slave. Yeah, I do know, like, I have known that she was in there. It's just, like, it was such a small game, and while, like, of course, like, her representation is entirely important, we just need more of it. Like, we need so much more, and we need it on a bigger scale.
Yeah, but it seems like they're starting to get there, but they're not all the way there. And I applaud them for trying, but they'll get there eventually because they've been called out. But I do have to say they've made me mad on a few of the games, but that might be me just being a purist to the original form of Assassin's Creed. But so far, but they're trying to keep up with the times.
Oh yeah, I'm very much in love with like just Assassin's Creed 1 and 2. Honestly, like even for their gameplay. Not so much for their graphics and everything, but, like, gameplay-wise, those two have to be my favorite. I know they've done a lot cooler things. And I know, like, a couple of the newer games kind of go back to that a little bit, but I just want more, like, old-school Assassin's Creed, not to sound like one of those old people who just want things to go back to the way they were, but I want more, like, living history and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. The new ones are just playing too much like RPGs and too much fantasy. They don't feel like Assassin's Creed. They, in my full and honest opinion, they just completely feel like a completely different game. They should have just, like, changed the title. And if they would have just changed the title of the game to a completely new IP, I would have been like, hey, this is a cool game. I love this game. But with it having the Assassin's Creed tag on there, I'm like, it's not the games I remember.
Yeah, I know, like, I guess they tried to do a little more history with having, like, that one feature where, either Origins or Odyssey, I think it's Origins, where you can, like, walk through like it's a living museum and not have to do anything.
Yeah, the Discovery Tour.
Yeah, but I don't know, make it the whole game again.
Yeah. One of these days, maybe they'll return to form, but I'm hoping good for the future. And I'm really excited for what they decide to do next, because it's always a surprise to me what point in history they always choose. Like, people always do try to guess which one, give a hypothesis on it, educated guess on which one's going to be the next one, but and usually they're pretty close, but but so far all the different ones, they do tell about great points in history, and I really do love, but they just, it seems like they have so much source material that they can never run out of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, history is a vast expanse of shit we don't know about. So, yeah, I'd be excited to see more, like, interesting, like, not so mainstream forms of history. I mean, like, they did that with AC1, but, like, pretty much everybody knows a little bit about the Renaissance. Everyone knows a little bit about ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and the Revolutionary War and all that. I don't know. And I know that there's not enough, probably, historical information to go off of for some of the more obscure timelines or, like, historical sections, but I think it would be more interesting. I mean, they're gonna run out of mainstream history eventually. They gotta keep something going, right?
Yeah, Chronicles was, I haven't gotten the chance to play it yet. I'm planning on it, but it's one of those spin-offs, and it's like 3 different games. One takes place in India, Russia, and China.
Oh yeah, I haven't played those, but I have heard of those too. Which, like, very cool, very exciting. I just, like, you know, like, I just want big games. Like, I know that they're trying to do everything in the smaller games, and I mean, that's really cool, but when it comes to the end of the day, they're not, it seems like they're just not giving, like, a lot of representation to, like, some really, really interesting parts of history that could be made. They're so interesting. They're, like, interesting enough to be put into full-length, like AAA blockbuster games, but they're just not doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I like off the top of my head, I can't really think of a point in time that I would really. They've touched on a lot of the points in time that I really wanted, but it was also mainstream. Like they did Vikings and they've done Greece, and they were able to in Origins touch on Rome a little bit, but well, the Roman Empire, but. With the Renaissance, you were also in Rome, but it seems like they've been dancing around Rome.
They really do be given that Eurocentric history, which I mean, like they're French, so I mean that's life. Or they're Canadian. I don't know why I said French. Are they Canadian?
It's French.
Okay, no, it is France. Okay, you can cut that part out. That's entirely idiocy on my part. But I do know that for me, and this is just they would net. I know I just said I hate spin-offs, but I would love to see a spin-off of the Minoan civilization. That could probably never happen. There's not enough information. We know like jack shit about the Minoan civilization, but I think that would be really, really cool.
Yeah, that would be really cool. But they were able to do Greece, which is the later part of the Minoans. So that's I'm okay with that because I like Greece a little bit more, but that's maybe because I don't know much about the Minoans.
Well, there's not a lot to know. I can explain it to you in like 3 paragraphs, but I'm not going to.
Yeah. But
anything else that you would like to say about Assassin's Creed?
I could go on for hours, honestly.
Oh yeah, so could I, but I think
we've touched on mainly everything that I wouldn't mind talking about right now. But that's our presentation.
Thank you guys for listening. We hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah. And catch you guys later.